People are waking up to the reality of the corporate work. The realization that the thing we have been told for most of our life to pursue often turns out to be one of the greatest sources of dissatisfaction, anxiety, and physical suffering is finally something that I have been hearing more and more people talk about. Now, before I continue, let me make something very clear, because I know how this conversation usually go. This is not a video saying that every corporation is evil, nor am I saying that every manager is incompetent, or that every corporate job is unbearable. Because there are genuinely good companies and good people working in them. I mean, I think I'm a good person myself, and I worked in corporations. So, to think that I'm the only one like this would be nothing but piety signaling on my behalf. I want to talk about a model of work that has become increasingly common, one that asks of us not only to sell our time, but gradually to reshape ourselves around the demand of an organization, often at the expense of our own well-being. And I want to explain why, after living through it myself, I reached the conclusion that I should never go back unless the model changes fundamentally or I have no other option left, which I think might not happen, but who knows. The reason why I feel comfortable talking about this is because I'm not repeating ideas that I read in a book or heard in a podcast. I experienced them myself. Every Sunday evening, I would begin to feel a heaviness thinking about going to work Monday morning. Nothing had happened yet. Monday hadn't arrived. Nobody had sent me an email. There wasn't any immediate problems to solve. And yet I could already feel my body preparing itself for another week that it clearly didn't want to live through. It was as if every week I had to become a slightly different version of myself in order to function inside that environment. For a while, I convinced myself that this is simply adulthood, that everyone felt this way, and that perhaps I just need to become mentally stronger because that is usually the advice people give you. They tell you to build resilience, to improve your mindset, to manage stress better, and while all of these certainly have their place, I eventually started asking myself a different question. What if the problem wasn't simply my ability to endure? What if my body was trying to tell me something that my mind kept refusing to acknowledge? There was a tension within me where my body was fighting against my mind and my mind against my body. That realization became impossible to ignore when, for the first time in my life, I started having panic attacks. Ironically, I used to be skeptical whenever people talked about panic attacks because I almost couldn't understand them. I remember thinking that if there is no immediate danger, then why would somebody panic? It almost seemed impossible to me that the body could react as though it was fighting for survival while the person was sitting safely in bed. Then one night it happened to me. I was trying to fall asleep when suddenly I started feeling as though I couldn't breathe properly. I felt like I wasn't getting enough oxygen. My chest became incredibly tight. I couldn't tell whether my heart was beating normally or not, and perhaps the strangest part of the whole experience was this overwhelming sense that something terrible was about to happen, even though absolutely nothing around me had changed. It is a very strange and difficult feeling to describe, unless you have experienced it yourself, because your rational mind knows that everything is fine while your body is behaving as though your life is in immediate danger. For months I had no idea what was happening to me. I went to sleep wondering whether it would happen again, and many nights it did. Then I started noticing something that in hindsight seems obvious. These episodes almost always appear during the most stressful period of my professional life. Looking back, I honestly believe that my body understood the situation before my mind was willing to admit it. That realization changed everything because it forced me to confront the possibility that I had been avoiding for a very long time, namely, that the life I had carefully built was making me ill. I lived like this for almost a year before I finally sat down one evening and I asked myself a question that, surprisingly, I had asked myself before but never followed the reasoning through because I was scared I knew I had to quit, and quitting for me was not an option. Do I genuinely wanted this to be my life? Because even if I managed to survive another year or two, what exactly was waiting for me on the other side? Another deadline, another sprint, another manager, another performance review. The work itself never really ends because the system is designed in such a way that there is always another objective to chase. That was the moment I understood that my problem wasn't with a particular company, it wasn't even with a particular manager, it was with a culture. One of the expressions you constantly hear in corporate environments is that they are looking for people who thrive in a fast-paced environment. And I have to admit that every time I hear that phrase now, I cannot help but cringe, because I genuinely think it represents one of the greatest inversions of values that has become normalized in modern work. Why is moving faster automatically considered better? Why have we convinced ourselves that speed is a virtue in itself? What about sitting there and think deeply about a problem or a concept? It is already known that some of the greatest scientific discoveries, philosophical works, and artistic achievements in human history were not produced by people constantly jumping from meeting to meeting while answering notification every 5 minutes. They were produced by people who had the space to think. And yet somehow we have created professional environments where thinking itself almost feels like a luxury, because the only thing that seems to matter is execution, as though human beings were machines waiting to receive the next instruction. The irony is that corporations often speak endlessly about innovation while simultaneously creating environments that leave very little room for genuine contemplation, because contemplation is slow, and slowness has somehow become synonymous with inefficiency, even though many of the most important ideas require exactly that kind of patience. The longer I stayed in that environment, the more I started realizing that what I was experiencing wasn't simply stress in the ordinary sense of the word, because stress is something we all experience from time to time. In many situations, it can be healthy if it is followed by periods of recovery. But what I was experiencing was something different, because there never seemed to be a genuine opportunity for recovery. Every week simply blended into the next one was immediately replaced by another, and after enough time I began to understand that my nervous system had simply stopped believing that it was ever safe to relax. Looking back, I understand that my body wasn't malfunctioning. I think it was doing exactly what it had been trained to do. Day after day, I had conditioned my nervous system to expect urgency, pressure, constant evaluation, and constant availability. And after enough years, it simply forgot how to live the fight or flight response. Even when I closed my laptop, even when I left the office, some part of me was still preparing for the next problem that hadn't happened yet. The panic attacks weren't the beginning of the problem. They were the final symptom of a body that had spent so long preparing for danger that it no longer knew how to recognize safety. And I think there is something profoundly important in that realization, because for years our minds are capable of rationalizing almost anything. We tell ourselves that this is simply adulthood, that everyone feels like this, that we just need to become more resilient, that things will improve after the next promotion or the next project is finally over. But the body cannot be lied indefinitely. Eventually, it starts speaking its own language. Sometimes it speaks through chronic fatigue, sometimes through insomnia, anxiety, and sometimes, as it did in my case, through panic attacks. The body eventually forces us to have a conversation that the mind has been postponing for years. Around that time, I had already started planning my exit from the corporate life. I didn't wake up one morning and impulsively hand in my resignation. I spent almost 8 months preparing for it, because I knew that if I wanted to leave, I wanted to do it responsibly. Since I already knew that I wasn't going to build my future there, I naturally stopped investing myself emotionally in all the corporate rituals that had once consumed so much of my energy. I stopped pretending to be excited about every initiative. I stopped caring about endless team building activities. I stopped forcing conversation that I knew would disappear the moment one of us changed companies. I simply couldn't bring myself to continue the game. Of course, people noticed. Eventually, my manager called me into a meeting and asked me what had changed. Why wasn't I participating anymore? Why wasn't I being a team player? Why wasn't I attending all the social events that the company was organizing for us? I remember him explaining that all of these things were meant to strengthen the team, improve collaboration, and create a better working environment. Now, of course, I didn't tell him what I was actually thinking, because there was no point. But while he was speaking, all I could think about was how to escape that way of living. My inconsistency wasn't caused by laziness or by lack of professionalism. It's caused by the simple fact that my mind had already left the building. My energy was being invested somewhere else, namely into building a life that no longer depended on that environment. And this brings me to something that I think deserves much more attention than it usually receives. namely the strange culture of artificial relationships that modern corporations often create. Human beings naturally form friendships wherever they spend enough time together, and some of my former colleagues are genuinely wonderful people whom I still respect. That is not what I'm criticizing. What I'm criticizing is the expectation that authentic relationship can somehow be manufactured through mandatory fun, organized social events, and carefully designed corporate culture, as though friendship were another KPI that could be optimized if only we schedule enough after work activities. Real friendship cannot be scheduled, they emerge naturally. The irony is that the harder we try to manufacture authenticity, the more artificial everything begins to feel. For a long time, I believed that quitting was a sign of weakness. We admire people who endure, we celebrate resilience, we praise those who keep pushing no matter what. But sometimes refusing to quit is the real surrender. Sometimes the courageous decision is to admit that a particular way of living is incompatible with the kind of human being you want to become. That doesn't mean anyone should resign tomorrow, of course. So if you are considering living corporate life, build something first. Save some money, reduce unnecessary expenses, create opportunities before you need them, because freedom is much easier to exercise when it has been prepared in advance rather than pursued out of desperation. And finally, I want to ask you something, because one of the reasons I started this channel was not to simply talk, but to start conversation that I think many of us have wanted to have for a long time. I am genuinely curious to hear your experience, because I know for a fact that I'm not the only person who has gone through something like this. Whatever your experience has been, I'd really appreciate it if you share it in the comments, because I think we'd all benefit from hearing honest stories instead of, carefully polished corporate narratives. I think a lot of us are done with that, or at least I know I am. And maybe if enough of us speak openly about what modern work is doing well and what is doing poorly, then we can start imagining healthier ways of working that respect not only our productivity but also our humanity. And lastly, if you find these topics helpful or interesting in any way, please consider subscribing. It would help me a lot. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.